Now we're going to be discussing Mannerism, or as I like to call it, the unraveling of the Renaissance. So what do I mean by this? Mannerism, right, comes after the Renaissance and is the first time we're going to talk about this idea of contrast. And what I find studying art history after the Renaissance is that art history really becomes about movements. And the movements are usually contrasting to one another. So if you have the Renaissance doing one set of things, right, you're then going to have a movement that does the opposite. So you might note that when we were talking about the Renaissance, I would talk about things like order, logicalness, that there's a sense of utility and purpose, right, in Renaissance works. They linear perspective. They like systems and they like things to be very clear to understand. There's not a lot of confusion in Renaissance works. What Mannerism does is say, okay, well, Renaissance artists did that. We don't think we can top that. So we're going to go in the opposite direction. So what I notice with art history is it's always this swinging back and forth. I kind of compare it to a pendulum, swinging back and forth, that once you go so far in one direction, order, logic, reason, then you have to come back in the other direction to like bizarreness, strangeness. It's just the way it goes. And it seems it's because we as humans get bored with things. I mean, that's the only way I can really try to explain it. That once we've been doing something for a while, then we want something different and new. And so in the case of art history, this is like, opposing movements back and forth pretty much throughout art historical time since the Renaissance forward. Before this, art really wasn't about movements as much as it was about cultures. So art history too, we get into movements as we call them. Mannerism is a movement of art history. And again, it's going to contrast with the Renaissance that came before it. Where does the term Mannerism come from? Art historians, they debate about this a bit, like, oh, it was in the manner of the Renaissance, but not quite. That's never really made a lot of sense to me. What I really like as an explanation is this idea of mannered gestures. Now, what is a mannered gesture? Have you ever seen people that the way they move and the way they talk, the way they use their hands, it all seems rather calculated or sort of done for show? In class, when I'm walking around, I normally show you a couple mannered ways of moving your body, but here we are, in a taped lecture, so I can't do that for you. But, I always say go look at like models and fashion magazines. A lot of the ways they hold their bodies, that's not the way a body would really work or move. There's that famous pose they do where they kind of hunch forward, where their collarbones stick out. It's a way of making the body look kind of stylized and kind of different than it should in its natural state. So to me, I think Mannerism is about moving and posing in a mannered way, a way that's not really in line with reality. So that's why I would say it's a rejection of realism, because I don't feel like what you see in Mannerism is about reality. So that's how I think about the term and how it applies to the works. Some other things you'll see in Mannerist works, very strange colors. I often refer to them as acidic. They almost seem to burn your eye. They're just really sharp. And they often are color combinations that your painting teacher would say, no, don't put those together. And Mannerists go, yeah, why not? So there's often these strange combinations of colors. They're often very acidic and bizarre colors. Very much a departure from those pastels you saw in the Renaissance, which were very nice and pleasant and, not harmful to the eye at all. And there's also the use of a lot of strange compositions. A composition is how a painting is put together. So linear perspective, like for instance, creates a composition. And there's a lot of unusual posing of figures, in the sense that the pose they usually hold, it couldn't be replicated in reality. So when that happens, I'll point those out and say, you couldn't really do this. As a real living person, you couldn't do it. So Mannerism is a little bizarre, a little fun. So I always enjoy speaking about this movement. Now, the first artist we're going to talk about, you may be surprised to encounter, which is Michelangelo. And many people aren't aware that, he does, as his career is ending, he does segue into Mannerist technique. He sort of collides with it at the end of his career, we might say. And one of the Mannerist pieces that we talk about with him is the famous Last Judgment painting, once again here in the Sistine Chapel. I mentioned that another pope would get their hands on him. That is Pope Clement VII. And this was the person that kind of traded the idea of like doing the sculptures for his tomb for painting this artwork. That's Pope Clement VII. So in a sense, Michelangelo was offered something for coming back to paint this painting. And if you compare the ceiling and then compare the Last Judgment, you can definitely tell they're from two different stylistic vantage points, that they're not happening at the same time. Where the Renaissance employs a lot of classical elements. The architecture, the statuary, the poses look very classical. It's very Renaissance. Then you look at the Last Judgment and you're like, ooh, something really changed here. Something's definitely going on here that's different from what he's doing before. The Last Judgment, it's about, basically Christ returning to earth, the wicked and the righteous. So he's judging, who will ascend to the heavenly realm and who will be left in the pits of torment, might we say. Some people argue that because Michelangelo probably didn't want to do this painting either, which, we know, that he made it kind of look like a skull. So if you're looking at it, you might notice it kind of looks like eyes and a nose, and some people argue it's like, oh, it's a skull leering out at you. When you focus in on the subject matter, you'll notice there's a strange oddness to it in bodily poses, bodily structure, colors that are used, and just these almost horrific details that you see employed throughout the piece, where people are struggling, they're trying to get away. It's just very nightmarish, right? And its quality. So people talk about, it's a big departure from the Sistine Chapel ceiling, which has sort of a rational kind of flow to it. Here's the image of the lost souls kind of being punted off the boat, the damned being emptied off. You might notice there's a lot of nakedness going on in here. And supposedly the Pope was like, oh God, what the heck with all these naked people? And tried to get Michelangelo to put pants on some of them. And he was like, yeah, no, I'm good. Like, it's this horrific scene. And supposedly they found some other guy to like paint pants on some of these people. And he was known as the pantaloon painter. And I'm like, that must be nice, right? And being known as the guy who painted pants right on Michelangelo's artworks. That's a way to go down in art history, right? But, it's just almost like gruesome, kind of imagery that's sort of tangled and flowing, and the composition is, again, very different than a nice linear perspective, orderly subject. So one of the things that Michelangelo does that we think registers his outrage at having to paint this painting is he paints himself, we believe, in the guise of St. Bartholomew. Now, St. Bartholomew is sitting there kind of on the cloud holding his skin. Why is he holding his skin? Saints become saints because they're killed in awful ways. In the case of St. Bartholomew, he was flayed alive. It means he was whipped until his skin came off. That's flaying, as we say. So he's holding his skin. Now, if you compare, though, St. Bartholomew's face and hair to his skin, you might notice they look quite different, because many people believe that the skin actually holds a self-portrait of Michelangelo. Go back and look at him in Raphael's painting and tell me if you agree. But again, this is a way of slipping in a sense, his portrait or his signature, but in a way that was like, God, painting this thing was like being flayed alive. Ha ha ha, right? And registering his displeasure. This is another Michelangelo that's more of a typical painting. Again, he did not consider himself a painter, but every now and then he'd get roped in to painting something for somebody. And this is his famous Doni Madonna. And this one's always talked about as being like what the heck is going on with this composition? Like, why is the baby Christ child crawling up over her shoulder? Like, why is she posed this way? Again, ladies, try to sit like this and, your back will start to ache in like 2 seconds flat. You'll be like, why am I rotating like a Rubik's Cube? Ooh, this is not fun. So people are like, what is this? So notice there's a high degree of unnaturalness in Mannerist work. It's just very unnatural. It doesn't seem to make sense. It kind of sticks in your mind like something's wrong here, right? It doesn't really make sense. And then you have that background with all these like kind of nude, naked, like what are they? Like these people prancing around the background. Some people argue that the background is meant to sort of represent pagan life, and that Christ is crossing over the barrier to signal that pagan life is done, the life of the Greco-Roman gods is done and Christianity has been born. I think it's a pretty good argument for why you have kind of this weird separation between the two sides of the painting. But again, you can get a little sense of Michelangelo's presence and mannerism by looking at these works. Some more very classically understood to be Mannerist painters, I'm going to show you those now. And the first one I want to show you is Pontormo in his work Descent from the Cross. Now, often when I'm teaching this work, I'm always like, maybe I shouldn't show them the title and let them guess what the heck is going on in this painting. Because I would argue that you wouldn't know. You'd be like, are they dancing? Like, what's happening? I give you the title, Descent from the Cross, and you're like, okay, well, that must be Christ, and they must have taken him off the cross after his crucifixion. Okay, I can go somewhere with that. But notice without the title, you're sort of left adrift, which Renaissance painters would never do. They would never put you in a situation where you're like, what's happening in this artwork? I can't figure it out. They would never do that to you. They'd be like, well, that seems... you shouldn't do that. Like, we can just try to tell the viewer what they're seeing. Be logical about it. But notice Mannerists are not logical, right? So they kind of set you up for failure immediately. So yeah, you're like, okay, thanks for the title so I can kind of get some hold on this painting. And then you start to examine the painting and you're like, God, this is just a hot mess, The composition is a nightmare. I always compare this composition to like a giant donut. Where the donut hole is like a void. It's a middle with nothing there. And again, if you talk to most painters about composition, they're like, you put what's most important in the center of the painting. You don't leave a hole there, So really, the painting just sort of circulates around the outer edges like a big giant donut or a washing machine, in spin cycle, just kind of going around and around and around. Notice your eye really has nowhere to rest. Where linear perspective takes your eye to a central vanishing point and leaves you there. It's like, here's the most important thing. There you go. Your eye is just wandering all over the painting. You're like, okay, I'm going around in circles. I don't know why. Why am I doing that? So Mannerism, I always joke, is really messy. It can be very confusing, very frustrating, and you're often just left going, I have no idea what's going on. I argue, even if you think about how are these people all standing where they're standing, it doesn't make sense unless they're kind of like on a hill or a slope or, I always think of like like a bleachers or a set of risers or something back there. Like, what's going on? Again, you're sort of having to suspend disbelief about how are they doing this? How are they posed way up there at the top of the painting? What are they standing on? And then you could go to like looking at the poses and you're like, no, this just doesn't work. Look at the two figures holding Christ. One of them, the one in the back, has this light hold on his body and almost has this sort of ballet stance on his tippy toes. And then the other one is crouched, holding the body, again, up on the tippy toes. Now, if you've done ballet, being up on your tippy toes, that means you don't really have a lot of opportunity to hold, you really couldn't hold any weight. And the same thing if you're crouched on your tippy toes. If you put weight on you, that probably wouldn't work out too great. So again, we're being asked to suspend disbelief a bit and believe that these two figures could hold this dead weight in the way that they're posed, which makes no logical sense. And then finally, you think about the colors, and they're very biting, strange, weird combos of these acidy kind of tones that make your eyes kind of go bleh, don't really like it. And then finally, you'll notice hiding off to the side, Pontormo. And there's the one guy in the painting who's wearing like earth tones. There he is, right? He's sort of hiding off to the side, kind of pulling a Raphael, like, hi, it's my painting, how you doing? Over there on the side, right? And again, if you compare contrast, you can kind of look at Leonardo, logical, linear perspective, everything makes sense, to Pontormo. And you can think Renaissance, Mannerist, Renaissance, Mannerist, and really see the divide that's created there. This is another Pontormo that shows you just how wacky his style would get. I love the crazy colors in this. I love the crazy composition. Just everything about it, you're like, it's so wild. Like, what's happening? I love kind of the little angelic Pooty figure over to the right standing on the plinth whose skirt's kind of blowing up. It looks like he's like disco jive dancing or something. You're like, is he like, I'm staying alive, right? It looks like he's pointing up in the air. like John Travolta, you're just left in this moment of like, what is going on? And it's called Joseph in Egypt. And you're like, is this supposed to help me? Like, I don't know. I love the staircase that seems to be going to nowhere. Like, it's just fabulous. So again, Pontormo, like, creating these really, really kind of wild compositions that you're just like, oh, okay, I really don't know what to make of this at all.